That night, Johnny Carson stopped his monologue mid-sentence and did something no one expected. The studio lights were warm. The audience was laughing. Doc Severinsen's band was setting up for the next segment. Everything was running like clockwork. 30 years of clockwork, to be exact. But then Carson reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and the entire room fell silent. He didn't smile. He didn't crack a joke. He just looked down at the letter in his hands. And for the first time in decades, Johnny Carson, the man who could charm a nation with a raised eyebrow, looked vulnerable. What happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments in television history. A moment that reminded millions of people why they invited Johnny into their homes every night. Not because he was funny, but because he was human. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. It was a Tuesday night in April 1981. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson had just hit its 19th year on the air. The show was an institution, a ritual. Families across America ended their days with Johnny's monologue, his witty banter with Ed McMahon, and the parade of celebrities who sat in that iconic guest chair. But this particular Tuesday started like any other. Carson walked onto the stage through the rainbow curtain to thunderous applause. The audience loved him. Always had. He adjusted his tie, flashed that signature grin, and launched into his opening monologue. He joked about Reagan. He joked about the weather. He joked about Ed's laugh. The audience roared. Everything was going perfectly. And then, about 4 minutes in, Carson paused. It wasn't a comedic pause. It wasn't a setup for a punchline. It was something else. Something the audience couldn't quite place at first. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded carefully, like someone had handled it many times. The paper was slightly worn at the edges. You could see it even from the back row. Carson unfolded it slowly. The audience quieted, sensing a shift. Ed McMahon, sitting at his desk to the side, leaned forward slightly. Doc Severinsen, standing with his trumpet near the band, lowered his instrument. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. "I want to read you something," Carson said, his voice quieter than usual. Not somber, just honest, real. The audience didn't know what to expect. Was this a bit? Was it another one of Johnny's curveballs that would turn into comedy gold? It wasn't. "This letter came to my office 2 weeks ago," he continued, holding the paper with both hands now, as if it were fragile. "It's from a woman named Helen. Helen Kramer. She lives in Ohio, and she's dying." The air in Studio One at NBC Burbank changed. You could feel it. The lightness evaporated. Even the crew behind the camera stopped moving. Carson looked down at the letter and began to read. "Dear Mr. Carson, my name is Helen Kramer. I'm 54 years old, and I have stage 4 cancer. The doctors say I have a few weeks left, maybe a month if I'm lucky. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to write to you anyway. For the last 18 years, I've watched your show almost every single night. You've been in my living room more than most of my family. You've made me laugh when I didn't think I could. You've kept me company when I felt alone. I don't have much time left, Mr. Carson, but I wanted you to know that you mattered. Not just as a host, as a person. You reminded me that even when the world feels heavy, there's always room for a smile. I won't be watching much longer, but I'll be watching tonight, and I just wanted to say thank you with all my heart, Helen." Carson finished reading and stood there, the letter still in his hands. He didn't speak right away. Neither did anyone else. The silence in the studio was profound, not uncomfortable, sacred, like everyone understood they were witnessing something rare. Ed McMahon's eyes were glassy. You could see him trying to hold it together. Doc Severinsen turned away slightly, pretending to adjust the sheet music, but his shoulders were tense. And then Carson did something he'd never done before in nearly 2 decades on air. He folded the letter carefully, set it on his desk, and walked out from behind it, not toward the guest chair, not toward the band. He walked toward the audience. The cameras followed him, but the operators were unsure. This wasn't blocked. This wasn't rehearsed. The director in the booth had no cue card for this moment. Carson stopped at the edge of the stage, right where the lights met the darkness of the audience seating. He looked out into the crowd, squinting slightly under the stage lights, and he spoke directly to them. "Helen," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I don't know if you're watching right now, but if you are, I want you to know something." He paused, and for a moment, it looked like he might lose his composure. But he didn't. He studied himself and continued. "You said I mattered. But you matter too. Every single person who's ever watched this show, every person who's taken the time to write, to laugh, to share a moment with us, you're the reason we're here, not the other way around." The audience was silent. A few people wiped their eyes. One woman in the third row was openly crying. "I've spent 30 years trying to make people laugh," Carson continued, "and I'm grateful for that. But tonight I want to do something different. Tonight I just want to say thank you to Helen, to all of you for letting me into your lives." He looked back toward his desk, then toward the cameras. "Helen, I hope you're watching, and I hope you know that tonight, this whole show, this whole night is for you." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Carson turned to the director and made a cutting gesture across his throat. "Stop the show." The director hesitated. They were live. You don't stop a live broadcast. But Carson wasn't asking. He was telling. The camera stayed on him as he walked back to his desk, picked up the letter again, and held it up to the camera. "This is going in my drawer," he said, his voice firmer now. "Right next to the first letter I ever got when this show started. Because this is what it's all about. Not the jokes, not the ratings. This." He tapped the letter twice with his finger. Then he set it down gently, like it was made of glass. The band didn't play. The audience didn't applaud. They just sat there holding space for the moment. And then slowly, one person started clapping, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet, applauding not for the show, not for Johnny Carson the entertainer, but for Johnny Carson, the human being who had just honored one woman's life on national television. Carson stood behind his desk, hands in his pockets, and nodded. He didn't bow. He didn't wave. He just stood there and let the moment be what it was. Ed McMahon walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. No words, just presence. Doc Severinsen raised his trumpet and played a single soft note, a gentle, mournful sound that filled the studio like a hymn. The crew members in the back, camera operators, stage managers, production assistants who had worked hundreds of shows, stood motionless. Several wiped their eyes. One young intern, fresh out of college, would later say that moment changed why she stayed in television. Not for the glamour, for the connection. In the control room, the director sat frozen at his console. His hand hovered over the button to cut to commercial, but he couldn't press it. Not yet. This moment needed to breathe. The applause continued for nearly 2 full minutes. Not the enthusiastic, punctuated applause of a punchline. This was different, sustained, reverent. The kind of applause that says, "We understand. We feel this too." Carson finally raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. "I want to say one more thing," he said, his voice carrying that rare blend of authority and tenderness that only he could manage. "Life is short, we all know that. But sometimes we forget to tell people what they mean to us. We wait. We think we'll have time." He picked up Helen's letter one more time, holding it carefully. "Don't wait," he said, looking directly into the camera. "If there's someone in your life who matters, someone who's made a difference, someone who's been there, tell them tonight. Don't wait until it's too late. Don't wait until they're gone." The studio was so quiet, you could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Helen reminded me of that tonight, and I'm grateful to her. So thank you, Helen, for watching, for caring, for reminding all of us what really matters. He set the letter down gently on his desk, gave it one last look, and then turned back to the audience. "We're going to take a break now," he said softly. "When we come back, well, we'll figure it out." It was an unprecedented thing to say. Johnny Carson always knew what was coming next. He had cue cards, producers, a carefully structured show. But not that night. That night he let go of the script. And then Carson looked into the camera one last time and said, "Good night, Helen, wherever you are." The screen faded to black. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. The next morning, NBC's phone lines were flooded. Thousands of people called, not to complain, not to criticize, to thank Johnny Carson for what he'd done. Letters poured into the studio by the hundreds, then thousands. People from all over the country writing to say that they too had someone like Helen in their lives. Someone who was sick, someone who was alone, someone who needed to be seen, and Johnny had seen her. The network executives were stunned. They'd worried that Carson's unscripted departure from the format would hurt ratings, confuse advertisers, break the rhythm that had kept the show on top for nearly 2 decades. Instead, the opposite happened. That episode became one of the most watched of the entire season. But more than that, it became something else, a cultural touchstone. Newspapers ran editorials about it, radio hosts played the audio, teachers showed clips in their classrooms to talk about empathy, about what it means to truly listen to another human being. Carson himself was shaken by the response. In a rare backstage moment caught by a crew member, he was seen sitting alone in his dressing room after the show, still holding Helen's letter. He wasn't crying. He was just sitting there staring at the words as if trying to understand the weight of what had just happened. His producer knocked softly and asked if he was okay. Carson looked up and said something that nobody expected. The producer didn't understand. Deserve what? This kind of trust, Carson replied, for someone to write me that letter to share something so personal. I'm just a guy who tells jokes on TV. But he wasn't, not that night. That night, Johnny Carson had been a mirror, a reflection of the best parts of humanity, the parts that care, the parts that stop and listen, the parts that say, I see you, you matter. And maybe that's why the moment resonated so deeply. Because in a world that often feels rushed, disconnected, and indifferent, Johnny Carson reminded everyone watching that we still have the power to pause, to witness, to honor. Helen's letter wasn't just a goodbye. It was a reminder that we're all connected by the shows we watch, the moments we share, the simple act of showing up for each other, even through a television screen. 3 weeks later, Carson received another letter. It was from Helen's daughter. Helen had passed away 2 days after the show aired. But she had watched that night. She had seen Johnny read her letter. She had heard him dedicate the show to her. And according to her daughter, Helen had smiled. She said she felt like the whole world stopped for her. The daughter wrote, even if it was just for a few minutes, thank you for giving her that. Carson kept that letter too. He never talked about it publicly. He never used it for publicity. He just kept it in the same drawer as Helen's original letter, along with a small note he had written to himself that night. Remember why you do this. Years later, when Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, he was asked in an interview what his proudest moment on the show had been. People expected him to mention a famous guest, a legendary sketch, a record-breaking rating. Instead, he said, the night I read Helen's letter. The interviewer pressed him, why that night? Carson thought for a moment, then smiled. Not his TV smile, but something quieter, more personal. Because that night I wasn't a host. I was just a guy who got to say thank you to someone who deserved to hear it. And I think that's the most important thing any of us can do. See people. Really see them. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The letter Helen wrote is no longer in Johnny Carson's desk drawer. When he passed away in 2005, his family found it among his most treasured possessions. It's now part of a private collection, preserved alongside other artifacts from his career. But the story doesn't end there. In the years since that night in 1981, countless talk show hosts have cited that moment as a turning point in how they approach their work. Jimmy Fallon once said in an interview, Johnny showed us that it's okay to stop being funny for a minute and just be real. David Letterman, who idolized Carson, kept a photo on his desk from that night. A still frame of Johnny holding the letter. He never explained why, but those close to him said it reminded him that television wasn't just entertainment, it was connection. Conan O'Brien, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, they all know the story. They all understand what Carson did that night. He broke the fourth wall, not with a joke but with his humanity. And in doing so, he reminded an entire generation of viewers that behind every screen, behind every camera, behind every monologue, there are real people. People who hurt, people who hope, people who just want to be seen. And so, in a way, were we all, because that night, Johnny Carson didn't just read a letter from a dying fan. He held up a mirror to the entire country and said, "This matters, you matter," and we believed him.